Welcome to the Capitalist Corner. I'm Michael Liebowitz, and today I am without Mark Pellegrino, who will hopefully be back with us tomorrow. And I got to tell you, I'm a little bit nervous today. I'm not really used to doing this sort of thing solo. I've had my own podcast for a little over 2 years, and I've been a regular guest on radio for over five now, but I'm not used to doing this by myself. Luckily for me, I'm especially ticked off today, so hopefully that will fuel a good show. And what has me ticked are these tariffs that Trump has burdened us with, these taxes on Americans that he thinks are going to lead us to prosperity. I assure you they aren't. Now, of course, I'm angry by the fact that these are an assault on the liberty of individuals in this country. Of course, I'm upset because of the economic consequences that are sure to follow. But what also upsets me is that online I found a number of people claiming to be objectivists, or maybe they are objectivists. Now, objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. It's the philosophy that guided me into turning my life around into becoming a better person. So it's very personal to me. And there are a lot of so-called objectivists who seem to think that these tariffs are a good idea. They praise Donald Trump. Some even call him a Randian hero. And what this brings to my mind is the absolute importance of understanding economics. Now, I've been told by fellow objectivists, some whom are very bright, that morality is the fuel. It's the argument to make when defending capitalism. And while I wholeheartedly agree that morality ought to be the focus, it's the primary argument for capitalism, that does not render economics irrelevant. And let me try to explain. So we have a situation where Ayn Rand's objectivism says that each individual ought to act in his or her best interest, right? Well, what if a free society, hypothetically, didn't produce what was in one's best interest? What if, as Trump, the lie he repeatedly puts out there, that we're being ripped off by these other countries, that it's in our interest to put tariffs on said countries? Well, now you have a situation where the argument is that economic government interference in the economy is actually in our own interest, and only a strong understanding of economic theory can get around that. So while morality is vital, and it is, as Greg Lewis says, the cornerstone of the arguments for capitalism, it isn't the only one. It's also important to understand economics. And let's kind of try to boil this down a little bit, and let's take a look at the economic theory on which Trump is relying. This economic theory goes back pre-Adam Smith, pre-1776, to an economic school of thought called the Mercantilists, and what is known as the Mercantilist Fallacy. So the Mercantilist Fallacy is the mistaken belief that a nation's wealth is solely determined by its stock of money or precious metals, particularly gold and silver, and that a trade surplus, more exports than imports, is inherently beneficial while a trade deficit is detrimental. Now, in 1776, Adam Smith publishes The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. In that book, he explains the mercantilist fallacy, and that all this is individuals choosing to trade. They value the products of another country more than they value the gold that they have, so they make a trade for that. And of course, individuals are going to go where the cheapest products are, and they should be allowed to do so. It helps the economy to grow when there's trade, right? Now, the great economist, or actually he wasn't an economist, he was a journalist, but he wrote on economic matters and very brilliantly. Henry Hazlitt, in his book Economics in One Lesson, explains very succinctly and very cogently that in the long run, there's no such thing as a trade deficit, right? Because what ends up happening is if I take my American dollars and I go buy products from the French, they ultimately have to turn around and spend those dollars here in America. So in the long run, it evens out. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's only in the terms of products, right? We could have a situation where they're investing in American companies. Maybe they're buying treasury bills, or maybe they're tourists. But nevertheless, they are spending those American dollars here. So there's no such thing over the long haul as a trade deficit. So Trump comes along and he says, well, we got to put these tariffs on, and he's hearkening back to the mercantilist fallacy. It's important to note that when in 1930 the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were put on the economy in America, unemployment was about 8%. After the Smoot-Hawley tariffs took effect, I think it was about a year, maybe within a year, the unemployment rate spiked to 16% and ultimately made it to 25%. Because what happens is not only do we put the tax on Americans, but then other countries respond, and you end up with less goods crossing borders, less trade, and it helps to fuel the unemployment that we had. Now, in researching this subject this morning, it seems that these tariffs that Trump has put on the economy are broader and bigger than Smoot-Hawley. So I can't see how anybody can make a legitimate argument that they won't cause the same degree of harm. And so we're at a point now in our country where we have a president who has a virtual cult behind him, who's putting taxes on Americans as he's being cheered. We're going to end up with a bad economy, and yet there are some pro-capitalist people, objectivists among them, some arguing for this. I think that as objectivists and as pro-capitalists in general, this is something that we absolutely need to destroy. These are anti-free market ideas, these are anti-capitalist ideas, and they are ultimately going to be harmful to the economy. Bonnie Bertrand asked, how does Trump describe a trade deficit in his own words? That I don't know. I can't remember off the top of my head. I just know that he repeatedly says that we're being ripped off. We've been being ripped off for, I think he says 50 years. And evidently in his little chart that he put up yesterday as he was discussing these tariffs, now according to Nick Gillespie from Reason Magazine, none of these numbers make any sense. I haven't investigated them myself, so I don't know if that is true or not, but I have no reason to doubt Nick Gillespie. He's always been a reliable source. But nonetheless, one of the things that Trump took into or says he took into consideration as he was putting these tariffs on is the size of the trade deficits that we have in with other countries. In other words, he says that our money's going to them and their goods are coming over here. So again, the mercantilist fallacy thinks that wealth is held in gold and silver, in money. Today, the money is fiat currency, money printed by the government. So Trump is making the mistake of assuming that wealth consists of money rather than goods and services. This is a mistake, and it's going to be a costly one down the line. There was I don't know if I should call it a hopeful sign in the Senate as they passed a resolution opposing it, but it's mostly symbolic. It doesn't have any effect. And it seems very few Republicans are willing to stand up to the Donald. There was 3 actually that voted against his tariffs: Rand Paul, Mitch McConnell, and I believe Lisa Murkowski. So they deserve some credit, maybe, or maybe they're just pandering to their constituents. I don't know, and you never really know with politicians. So Alan Thomas says, how does IMF investment in, say, Bolivia fit with deficits when it's American banks and engineering companies that ultimately receive the IMF investment and then the rents from Bolivians? I don't know much about Bolivia, nor do I know much about the IMF, to be honest. I confess my ignorance. But ultimately, it sounds to me like you have the situation where people are just investing where they choose to invest. And ultimately, we're all better off if we're allowed to trade. Trade is not a zero-sum game. If I trade something with you, we both perceive that we're benefiting. Otherwise, we will not make the trade. Karl Marx said that when 2 people trade, they're trading things of equal value. Otherwise, a trade couldn't happen. But if the participants to a trade didn't perceive that the objects actually were of unequal value, a trade can never happen. Why would I give away something that was just as valuable to me as the object that I'm getting? I wouldn't do it. It would make no sense. I would only do it if the object I'm getting is actually worth more to me, not to Karl Marx, not to John Maynard Keynes, but to me. If I don't judge it to be worth more to me, I am not going to make the trade. All right, so I want to move on to the national debt. The national debt, as of now, I believe, is upwards around $37 trillion. It's astronomical. I've been hearing about this since I was a kid when Ronald Reagan was in office. And I read this morning that the Republicans, or that the Senate, passed a resolution that would cut the deficit by $1.5 trillion over a 10-year period. I also read that they have instructions to raise the debt ceiling by, I believe, what was it, $5 trillion. So it occurs to me, why do they have to raise the debt ceiling if they're going to be cutting the deficit? And the reason is because the projected deficit for this year alone is 1.9 trillion. So if that number stayed the same, the 1.9 trillion, assuming that we don't increase spending, assuming we don't take in less revenues, and they cut this 1.5 trillion over 10 years, that means in 10 years we would still have a $400 trillion deficit. That means we're going to continue adding to the debt over the next 10 years. Now, I remember when Trump ran the first time and he said getting rid of the debt. He didn't say deficit, he said the debt. It would be an easy thing to do. Well, evidently we're not going to do it for the next 10 years. And here's the problem with that is these projections are often based on static analysis. They don't take into consideration the changes that are going to occur. For instance, when you put an astronomical tax on the American people in the form of tariffs, what's going to happen? So if we have a recession, for instance, which I think is becoming more and more likely, we are going to be taking less money into the Treasury, which means that the deficits will actually grow, not shrink, regardless of what the Republicans in the Senate think they're going to accomplish. So it's going to be more of the same. Again, we have a situation where the Donald is simply not pro-capitalism, neither are his followers. Thankfully, we have a party now that actually is advocating for capitalism, the American Capitalist Party, headed by Mark Pellegrino, and I am the vice chairman of the party, and we are looking forward to making these arguments for years and years to come, and hopefully we will be bringing more and more people to our side. Alan Thomas says, by Trump logic and based on Trump history, bankruptcy seems like his ultimate goal. Do you agree or disagree? I don't know what his goal is, especially because he's so dishonest. It's very difficult to tell when he thinks he's doing right and when he's not. I do think, though, I was reading this morning about Trump, just to take this off to the side a little bit. And the guy who ghost wrote The Art of the Deal for Trump said that Donald Trump is the most evil person that he's ever met, he's ever encountered. And I'm thinking about all the people that worked for Donald Trump that have since disavowed him, all the people that he appointed. Now, remember, he said he's going to appoint the best people. So if they're lying about Trump, well, then they're not the best people. And if they're telling the truth, then Trump is no good. Either way, it seems like Trump is here caught between Scylla and Charybdis and ultimately is just not a good guy, not a very bright guy. And you mentioned the bankruptcies that he went in, and I remember seeing that he was bailed out of the bankruptcies because the bank simply had too much invested in him. It seems to me that Trump is largely a TV character created by NBC and the writers of The Apprentice, and we have a large portion of Americans who have bought into the character that he was on TV. It'd be like thinking that Christopher Reeves is actually Superman. Bonnie Bertrand says, are we giving Trump too much credit to assume he knows about mercantilism or that it's a fallacy? If Trump can't see the mutual benefit of trade, aren't tariffs just arm twisting to control others? I am not assuming, Bonnie, that Trump has ever even heard of mercantilism or the mercantilist fallacy. I do think that he's heard these arguments that people put out there that we're being ripped off, that the trade deficit is unsustainable, that sort of thing. That these ideas are the mercantilist fallacy. It's not that he's actually studied mercantilism. I don't know. She says that this arm twisting to control others, maybe. I mean, it's hard to tell with him because he's so erratic in his behavior. He seems to not be moored to reality in any way, shape, or form. He lies as frequently as he tells the truth. So I ultimately don't know what his goals are. All I know is that the end result of the policies he's putting forth are not going to be good. And that is bad for us as Americans, especially for those of us who value freedom and capitalism. Race Jacobson says, speaking of the debt and the party, is there anything you want me to modify for the debt action plan? That, sir, you're going to have to speak to the aforementioned Mark Pellegrino about. I don't know what he wants to do with that. So you can get with him and have a discussion about that. Now, we've been talking about the debt. We've talked about tariffs. And it makes me think about the best ways to argue for capitalism. Now, I recently, just a few minutes ago, mentioned how it's vital to know economics. And I think it is. But I read an article this morning. Let me find it here. In FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, which I think is a good organization, by the way. They introduced me to a lot of economics, and from them I ultimately found Ayn Rand. So I really don't have anything bad to say about them. But there was an article today, and it's called "Only quote selfish unquote Capitalism Creates Prosperity for All," and the author basically argues that even with our base behaviors, our selfish behaviors, capitalism ultimately modifies our or takes our propensities for selfishness and spreads them out for the good, that it ultimately turns into the good for everybody else. I think that's a horrible way to argue for capitalism, because capitalism ultimately rewards selfishness, self-interest, rational self-interest. I'm going to stay away from selfishness, and I know my objectivist friends may not like that I stay away from it, but I'd rather not argue about the meaning of selfishness. So I would just say rational self-interest. People should be acting in the rational self-interest, and capitalism, the system that upholds individual rights, allows them to do so. Now, an ancillary benefit of that is that the wealth does trickle down. Ultimately, institutions are created that help those who are less fortunate, who can't work for themselves, maybe the mentally ill, the disabled, whatever. That's true, but that's not the argument we should be making for capitalism. We should not be arguing for the deformities and defects in human nature, and that thankfully we have capitalism to save us from ourselves. We should be promoting the idea that people should act in their own best interest, and promoting the idea that capitalism allows us to do so. Interestingly, I read another article. What the hell's the name of the magazine now? I don't remember. I got to look it up. It is the Counterpunch, a big left-wing magazine, and the article was called "The Collapse of Liberalism." And mind you, it doesn't matter if we agree with the principles that they were talking about. The author's point was that we have to argue from principles, or that he has to argue from principles, but his point is correct. Because what he says is, how can Democrats now argue about Trump bombing, for instance, Yemen, when they allowed Obama to do the same thing? Or how can they argue against tariffs when they were all for it when Biden did it? He was arguing for a principled approach. And that is vital if we are going to make the case for capitalism, is that we do so based on principle, not pragmatism, especially short-range pragmatism. We need to put forth the moral, ethical case for why capitalism is good, for why capitalism is right, for why the principle of individual rights must be defended. And that is a large goal of this show, is to do just that. So James Valiant says some say that U.S. factories and manufacturers are lost from foreign tariffs. How do you reply? I'm going to need you to elaborate a little bit, Jim, because I'm not fully understanding the question and I want to give my best answer to that. So if you could just put your thinking cap on that and use that big Jim Valiant brain and expand on the question just a little bit, that would be absolutely fantastic. And anybody else, if you've got questions, please post them. It would be a big help to me. Like I said, I'm not used to doing these things alone, but if you ask questions, it will give me a chance to run my mouth a little bit more and stay on the air just a little bit longer and be a big help. Jim says some say that U.S. factories and manufacturing are lost from foreign tariffs. I think what Jim is saying, he hasn't typed again, maybe he's left us. I think what he's saying is that given the tariffs that other countries are putting on America, that some American manufacturing companies are losing business or are going out of business. I really, okay, it says Trump was joined by a Detroit auto worker who cited the closure and underutilization of Detroit factories. Okay. I'm reminded here of two things. One, Joseph Schumpeter's Principle of Creative Destruction and Nathaniel Branden's article in The Virtue of Selfishness about the divine right of stagnation. The principle of creative destruction is, in essence, that through progress, through the creation of new products, new services, new ideas, you're ultimately going to displace existing services. But it's creative in the sense that we benefit in the long run from it. Nathaniel Branden, with the divine right of stagnation, talked about that people don't have a right to the status quo, to their existing way of life, to their existing jobs. They have to continue to compete and to do better. If American companies cannot compete, then they need to do better. But part of the problem here, and this is the thing that maddens me, is capitalism often gets the blame. But if you look at these industries, the auto industry especially, they have their unions. The unions artificially lift the wages of their their employees, give them all kinds of benefits, and ultimately that leads to less cars being produced because you can't hire as many employees, you can't buy as many, the factors that go into making cars. So you end up with less cars. All things remaining equal, the supply of a product goes down, the price goes up. So people end up paying more for the car. The car then can't compete with foreign cars. They go out of business. So now they demand more protection. It's the principle that controls lead to more controls, right? Once the government gets involved, it just leads to more and more. What we need to do is start scaling back, not adding to the already burdensome regulatory system that we have. So, Jim, I don't agree that tariffs will protect these jobs. Now, here's something that Henry has. Matter of fact, let me flip that. Tariffs can benefit special interests, right? They can maybe keep an automobile company in business longer. What tariffs cannot do is benefit the economy as a whole, and ultimately they're harmful. And let's just take the simple example that I just read about this morning from Henry Hazlitt. He gives the example of a sweater. And he says, suppose an American company can only produce their sweaters as such so that they can sell them for $30. But a British company is producing them so as to allow Americans to purchase them for $25. So because we have that $25 instead of $30, we now have $5 extra, all the purchasers of sweaters, that they can go buy other products with. That helps employment elsewhere. That helps other companies grow. That leads to further satisfaction of the consumer, his need. Now, if the American company petitions the government, says, I need a tariff, give me a tariff of $5, that makes their product just as expensive as mine. In that circumstance, yes, the American company is protected from competition and people may buy their product, they get to stay in business. But now the American consumer has less money to spend elsewhere. So, what about the employment in those other industries? What about the jobs in those other industries? What about the entrepreneurs in those other industries? And overall, we end up with less goods and services, which is what we want if we are going to have a thriving economy, a free society. Bonnie Bertrand says freedom would be so much easier. Bonnie, I agree. Freedom would be easier and it would be wonderful. Part of the problem, though, is that freedom entails responsibility. And I think there's just a lot of people who don't want to be responsible for their own lives. They don't want to have to do things for themselves. They don't want to take on the necessary risks that are in being alive. They want to be protected from them, but ultimately they cannot be protected from them. It reminds me of this, right? I'm sure most people listening know that I spent 25 years in prison. In prison, I was relatively secure. I mean, you do have to worry about violence, of course, but it's not as bad as it's made to sound when you turn on your nightly news or watch an episode of Oz or whatever that show was. So in prison, I'm secure. My decisions are made for me. I'm provided with 3 meals a day. There's laundry days so that I don't have to, figure out when I'm going to do my laundry. I don't have to do it. They do it. I don't have any bills to pay. I'm not paying electricity, heat, pay for air conditioning. I can watch my TV whenever I want. I don't have to worry about the cost of that. My light in my cell I can keep on as long as I want, as long as I'm not, upsetting my cellie. So I'm free of responsibility, but I'm not free, right? I've said it many times when I was incarcerated. I'd rather be free and living under a bridge than have the security of being locked in a cage. But it seems that many people, they don't see it as the cage. I mean, it's not a literal cage, but it is a lack of freedom. It's restraint on what you can do, on who you can trade with. That is just not it's not a good thing. So let me see. We have here, Greg Lewis said, Henry Hazlitt's broken window fallacy. Yes, absolutely. I cannot recommend Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson enough. It's available free on PDF online. You can find it. There's many articles by Hazlitt from the Mises Institute, from the Foundation for Economic Education, and probably elsewhere. And it's very worth reading. It's very accessible. It's easy to read. It's not difficult to understand at all. Bonnie Bertrand says, didn't a major steel company near Detroit just lay off something like 1,000 persons because of Trump's steel tariff? I think on Canada, I'm not sure. And Greg Lewis, the very wise Greg Lewis, says the layoffs were in the steel company as well as their mining interest. If they are not going to make as much steel, they don't need to mine as much raw material. And Greg Lewis, let me just thank you for saying, not only for your comment here today, but you said something one time online that I've kept with me, and I've plagiarized you numerous times. When I had a debate with somebody, you said it was like trying to nail Jello to a tree. And I've used that many, many, many times since then. I thought it was great. Jim Valiant says, ironically, domestic labor laws destroy such jobs, even as unions demand tariffs to protect their sector. I have a hard time agreeing as a universal principle, Jim, because sometimes they can protect industries by protecting them from competition. So while it protects some jobs, it's going to harm others or prevent others from coming into being. So it's not the case that tariffs can never protect anybody. They're just not good for the bulk of us. And if they're applied universally, like Trump is doing, then, all bets are off. There's no telling what's coming down the pike and how bad this thing's going to be. I just think it's going to be very, very bad. And I'm wondering, and I'm curious what the people in the chat think. All of the people who tout Trump as the great deal maker and the great capitalist and the savior of America, when the economy crashes, and I'm pretty confident it will under Trump's stewardship, do you think people will change their minds? Will they see the light on the Trumpster? My bet is no. What I predict will happen is they will blame the deep state. They will blame foreign influence. They will blame the people that Trump has appointed. They might blame Elon. I think they will blame everybody but Trump and his policies. And that is a very bad state of affairs. It reminds me of the religious group, and I don't remember exactly who they were. I think Jim will probably remember as the great religious historian. There was a group of people who thought that God was going to take them home if they just, that he was coming to get them and that they should prepare. And they did everything to prepare for him to come get them. And then they, of course, God did not come get them. And rather than stop believing, they doubled down and they said, well, God spared us because we were so loyal, because we were so faithful to him, because we obeyed his commands. And I just think that that's the type of thing that's going to happen with Trump and Trump's followers. Greg Lewis says Trump, the great snake oil salesman. Yes, a mountebank, he definitely is. And Katrin Kohler says that she does not think that they will turn against the Donald. They will find ways to make him look like a victim. That is something else that I think warrants discussing. Oh my goodness, Bonnie says she almost forgot to like the show. Oh my goodness, make sure you like the show and share it and tell other people to subscribe as well. Now I forgot what I was going to say, Bonnie. I was so distraught that you forgot to like the show. I was talking about the Trumpster, and what was I going to say? I don't really remember. Well, that sucks. Hopefully it'll come to me in a minute. In the meantime, victimhood. Yes, that's it. So one of the things that has been very disheartening to me, early on in my political life, when I started paying attention to politics, I considered myself a Reagan conservative. And one of the things that drew me to conservatism was the idea of personal responsibility and just the absolute refusal to accept people's excuse for being victims. And conservatives were very fond of pointing out that groups like African Americans, for instance, had a victim culture, and that they would not allow African Americans to blame slavery or blame Jim Crow or the neighborhoods they grew up in. They said, no, you're individuals, you have to be responsible for yourselves. And lo and behold, I don't know if it was pre-Donald or if Donald brought it in or what, but the Republican right in this country has become a victim culture. We're being ripped off by other countries. We're victims of the elites. We're victims of the system. And what do they look for to help? The government. They're not saying, wow, let's reduce the size and scope of government, despite Doge and all the massive fraud and abuse they're finding. It's interesting, with all the fraud and abuse they're finding, it doesn't seem the deficit's going down at all with all the cuts that they're making. So who knows? We'll have to wait and see. But that's certainly counterbalanced by the increase in government that they're proposing in terms of going after immigrants and deportation and these tariffs. Elon has a statutory 130 days before financial reporting and oversight kick in, from Alan Thomas. Well, I'm looking forward to that financial reporting and oversight to see what's going on with Doge. I'm not optimistic. I've never been optimistic about them. I think even if some of the cuts they're making are good in context, they're probably not, because they're not principled, right? So it reminds me of Leonard Peikoff's admonishment in Opar, that to be of value, something has to be conceptualized as such and chosen. That just, randomly throwing darts, even if you hit a bullseye, doesn't make you a good dart player, in essence. So I'm not really optimistic about Doge. Race Jacobson says conservatives conserve whatever the left was doing 10 to 15 years ago. What was happening 10 to 15 years ago? Obama. What's Trump doing now? Exactly. Well, you kind of have a point there, Race. Yeah. Somebody once said to me that Republicans are just liberals going the speed limit. They're just not going as quickly as the wayward Democrats go. Greg Lewis asked, will Congress and Senate grow the cojones to reclaim their claim to being the sole source of tariffs? No, they will not. Um, the Republicans certainly won't, because that would inflame the Donald. And the Democrats, I don't think they even would, because they would want the power for their president when he gets elected. Which brings me to, I think, what's going to be the last topic for today before I give the capitalist thought of the day. And that's this idea that's out there that the Democrats are dead. They have a 26% approval rating. They're circling the drain. They're ready to, the nails getting ready to get put into the coffin. It wasn't so long ago I was hearing this about the Republicans, right? That the Republicans were done for. The cases of the deaths of either of the parties has been greatly exaggerated, I'm afraid. I don't believe the Democratic Party is going anywhere. I think they will retool. They will find a way. There are people in this country who do not like Donald Trump, and they need a place to go. And I think a lot of them will just go Democrat. The Democrats will have to retool their message. But hopefully, as the American Capitalist Party, we will be able to peel some people away from both sides, from the disaffected, the people who don't find their interests represented, who want a party that actually recommends for principled liberty, which we are doing and nobody else is. And, that in large part is on us to get the message out, to communicate these ideas. And I hope that I'm doing a good idea, and I know Mark does a good idea. And we have a virtual, a mini army of people that are in the chat that are helping to spread the message as well. And I really hope that they continue to do so. Thank you all. Yep, Race Jacobson says, just like the expats of the Democrats who rallied around Trump. Yeah, I mean, that's what happens. The parties reshape themselves in large measure to fit demographics, to fit the viewpoints of the country, and I'm sure they'll do it again and again and again and again. All right. I've ran my mouth for quite some time now, and I'm afraid that I'm going to have to cut out because I really have nothing else to talk about unless somebody has a good question. If someone puts a good question in the chat, I'll definitely stay on. Okay, so my capitalist thought for the day is all about liberty. I'm frequently told that the liberty that I advocate is conceptual, that it's abstract, that it's too principled, that I need to live in the real world. In the real world, we have choices, and Trump was the better choice. I disavow that idea 100%. I think that the second we sell out our principles for pragmatism, we've already lost the game. What we need to do is stick to our principles, argue for them, push for them, and then we can see them realized in reality. And when those principles get implemented in reality, we will see that they are what is practical. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow when Mark Pellegrino is back with me. For now, I'm Michael Liebowitz, and remember to check out my other show, The Rational Egoist. I have a new episode out today all about whether cartels should be viewed as terrorists and treated by the weapons of war. Check it out. I think you will like it. All right, folks. Till tomorrow, again, thank you so much.